Welcome to my lightning talk given at DevDays2024 on in defense of open source versus closed source from a producer, consumer, and developer point of view. And just for clarification, the views I may give here are my own and not those of my employer. All right, first we're going to talk about producer. We're going to go a little bit faster, but producers, companies that have open source or they decide to close their already existing open source or they're just deciding what to do with it, always ultimately come to a fork in the road. And we're going to kind of talk about what they have to deal with. So usually how does software even come to be, right? An idea is formed or it's pulled from a larger organization. They say, oh, let's make that open source. Let's get out to a broader community buy-in and support. And there's a lot of hype and the community involvement builds up and out. And there's a lot of code and PR and releases. And maybe some of those people that were in that company that open sourced to decide, hey, I think we can fork off and make a new company. And they leave and start that up. Or somebody takes that open source product and says, hey, I can commercialize that. I'm going to make a company, and they hire up some staff. We then see it scale, and if it's really successful, they start to make enterprise editions, or they add support, or they put features behind paywall. I think of Portainer, for an example. It's a great open source tool that does paywalls for certain features. The cloud providers then create SaaS offerings of the open source or community editions, and as things grow, there's ultimately a pivot. Either it's a need for profit or they want to get acquired, but they'll change their license to, big air quotes here, protect assets. They'll claim others are, again, air quotes, stealing their product. And I remember having a vendor talk to me, a field CTO, and tell me, oh, this other cloud vendor stealing their product. And I thought, actually, the cloud vendor's using your product and giving you growth. All right, let's look at a case study. These are some recent companies to close source. And I'm going to talk about these ones just because they're kind of near and dear to my heart, not any other reason. We're going to talk about IBM Hashi Corp, MongoDB, Elastic, and Redis. So these companies, they're in my neck of the woods, or at least my space. 2018, MongoDB switched from the new Apache GPL to a new server-side public license. And they initially tried to get the SSPL to be open source, but the OSI declined it, and they've ultimately withdrew it in 2019. In 2021, Elastic, the company, decided to move from Apache 2.0 to that same SSPL for Elastic and Kibana. They thought our Elastic product, which, we use Elasticsearch a lot, and Kibana would be a good commercial offering, so they switched it to SSPL. 2023 in August, so just over a year ago from the time I'm recording, Hashi Corp dropped the Mozilla public license for this non-open source business source license. They kind of made it up, loosely based on the SSPL, but a new license. And then in 2024, March, Redis switched from their dual license BSD to an SSPL and another variant for their enterprise product. What was the impact, right? So what do we see here? We can see that code commits, if we're looking at this from a source code, when Apache or when Hashi did it, Terraform definitely didn't really see a drastic drop. We see a little bit of a drop right here, but we do see the commits just take off, So from 827 on out, we're getting a lot more commits to OpenTofu than we are to Terraform. So this is 50, that's 60, or not, they're about the same. And kind of how did it impact the companies? MongoDB didn't do layoffs, but they did slow hiring in 2023, and they looked to manage out underperformers. And so there's you can see some Glassdoor reviews, not so many people happy with it. Shortly after or around the time that Hashi changed their license, their founder, Mitchell Hashimoto, left the company, and it was a very positive messaging. He's moving on, but he's a big supporter of open source. He contributes to open source. He builds on open source. And I kind of saw the writing on the wall, though no official reason was given. Less than a year after changing license, Elastic announced a 13% reduction in force. And Redis Labs is still started private funding, but they haven't done any new funding since their Series G in 2021. As you can see here, MongoDB has continued to add services to their product. And Hashi Corp, which is all in on the HCP and using a cloud product, is now moving more towards these bolt-on add-ons to their product. Of course, they're being acquired by IBM, so that's a different story altogether. So kind of what are the reactions from the open source community? So when MongoDB changed their license in 2018, the cloud providers didn't care. They already had AWS DynamoDB and Azure Cosmos DB and GCP Bigtable, but we see things like Apache Cassandra take off. FerretDB is a new player. CouchDB, which I really shouldn't put in open source as of a few weeks ago, But CouchDB was an open source one that started to grow. Sorry, that was CockroachDB. I apologize. CouchDB is still open source. Elastic, when they changed the license, OpenSearch, was created and has offerings in the cloud. I mean, almost immediately AWS came out with a provided OpenSearch option. Hashi Corp, which I kind of put in parentheses IBM, I don't know when you'll listen to this, whether the acquisition's completed. But shortly after they changed the license, OpenTofu took off, and it really has taken off with a lot of vendors backing it. OpenBow, a Vault alternative, also took off, but I haven't seen as much contribution. And we see broad support for OpenTofu. You can see it in GCP, AWS, and more. Redis, they changed their license in 2024, and Valkey took off, and Valkey's really on fire. I mean, a lot of people are using it. It's a funded product by the Linux Foundation. And we also see Microsoft released a .NET equivalent that's Redis, the standard compliant with Microsoft Garnet. So we look at open source versus closed source. Some of the benefits of open source is the momentum. You really get that kind of building of your open source tools. The community steps in to support it. People are happy to build third-party integrations into your open source project. You definitely get cloud adoption if you get big. I mean, there's no sense not to, right? They want to make money. They're going to sell infrastructure with your product on it. Scaling, you can always scale open source products. And I feel, it's a feel statement, CVEs are more quickly addressed because any sort of critical vulnerability is found and fixed by the open source community. The consequence of going open source is it's out of your control. Once you let that cat out of the bag, it's not yours anymore. You may have started it. Ultimately, it'll be controlled by governing bodies. So again, other groups will be in charge of it. It does mean more competition. If you make a really solid offering, others are going to pick it up and make their one-offs to it. You got to find revenue in other ways, like services, add-ons, extended products. I think of Google released Kubernetes because they didn't want to be the only Kubernetes provider. They'd rather have Kubernetes as the standard to make the best Kubernetes they can with GKE. So some of the benefits of closed source, you maintain full control and you get to charge whatever you want for your solution. But the consequence is you are definitely in charge of all the security and fixes. There's large ramifications for errors. We can think a little over a month ago of the time of recording of CrowdStrike, right? We all know what happens when you have a closed source that doesn't share how it does things. Competition that gains traction is hard to fend off, right? You have to be the best at your price point because people are coming at you. And you got to spend a lot of budget for sales and promotion, trade shows. I think of our friends over at Harness and how much they spend on swag and trying to get us to listen to the phone calls. So a lot of goes into that marketing. And eventually you'll have slow growth and be replaced. All software products ultimately terminate. Nothing lasts forever. So you have to think of your pivot or what you're going to be making for a suite or your next steps at all times. So from a consumer point of view, right? We're choosing whether to use open or closed source solutions. So the question we have to ask ourselves when we're looking at any sort of product is, can we evaluate the full product first? We definitely can with open source, but with closed source, it's a maybe, right? Sometimes the closed has a free or a trial, but a lot of times you get those phone calls and they go, "Oh no, we can build that." You go, "Okay, I don't know. Can we scale?" Yes. Ultimately, open source is just limited on your team's technical implementation abilities and your implementation details. And closed source is often limited by both that and pricing, right? Because you got to think of the pricing aspect. Is it going to persist? I mean, open source will always persist. I mean, you can run Fortran 77 compilers if you still got the code, right? It'll live forever. But closed source will probably go away. I mean, there'll be a point unless you have a persisted on-prem version. So I marked an X on the closed source. Can we extend? Always yes on open source. But closed source is largely dependent on REST APIs and extension touch points, which can be removed. And I'm thinking of our friends at Atlassian Jira, right? I used to have Atlassian Jira as an on-prem Java app with a great rich plugin system you could build and extend from and a really great REST API. But Jira moved to a cloud-only offering, and on top of it, they reduced what you could do with the REST API. So arguably, it's gotten less extensible rather than more extensible. Is there community for learning and sharing? You can always find write-ups and blogs and documentation for open source. Closed source depends on how many people use it. I mean, there'll be like certification paths, sometimes training books, but Closed source is iffy about whether you get a lot of documentation. So what's the strategy for success? I recommend you start with open source, try free and open source, fail fast, try a lot of proofs of concepts. Then your engineers and your operations team, your devs, your DevOps, your SREs are going to build and maintain until the scale becomes untenable. And you might stop there. You might build something out and you're just fine. But when it gets to be too big, then you start looking at cloud offerings or commercial offerings. You migrate into scalable open source SaaS offerings. I know a past employer I did was a big fan of Terraform, right? And so we ended up going with the full version of Terraform when it was an open source product. So vendor agnostic choices. Don't be beholden to one company or one company's pricing, right? One of the reasons I still like Terraform as a language is I have choice. I don't have to worry about will IBM raise the price and I can no longer do my infrastructure as code. I can still do OpenTofu. AI and documentation, right? There's more crib on anything that is open source. So if I search for how to implement something in Redis, I'll find a lot of docs. If I search for how to implement something in PubSub, again, a good product from GCP, but closed, I may not find as many documents on how to implement that, right? So there's more learning and documentation. And the build versus buy. When it's open source, the decision's based on your staff capabilities and business needs, not based on forced hand choices. I can think of multiple occasions in my past of having to migrate from a solid tool purely based on license cost increase. And now we start to think of some of these great products that have gone away over time simply because they're closed source. Docker Swarm was going to be big, right? AWS backed it big. But it went away because the open source Kubernetes was taken by every vendor and took off. So Docker Swarm was bought by Mirantis, now pretty much gone. Oh man, so much love for Sun Microsystems. But after Oracle bought them and changed licensing and costs, I don't know anybody who uses or pays for Oracle JDK anymore. I see mostly OpenJDK and Zulu everywhere I look, so definitely not the same as it used to be. Chef and Puppet are two that are near and dear to my heart. Boy, I love these vendors. I remember Chef Summits, the Puppet people coming in to bring some bagels to the company I worked at. Great companies, great products, but ultimately they were surpassed. Things that were more open source like Ansible went out. CoreOS is a great company. I used to have t-shirts of theirs, still do. They were going to make the best, most durable commercial containers you could use, but ultimately their business didn't take off and they folded. Rational, again, those that have no hair or gray hair may remember Rational Software. When I gave this talk in the room, a couple guys caught me afterwards and said, "Oh, I remember Rational Rose." So yeah, Rational ClearCase, Rose, ClearQuest. They still exist as a variant of IBM, but certainly not what they were before. And then not as many people remember that icon, but that was the old Hudson icon. Before Oracle bought Sun, Hudson was the open source CI/CD tool. And after the trademarking of Oracle, it changed to Jenkins. And so it became Jenkins CI. And that's what we think of today as Jenkins, but that was the original Hudson icon. So from a developer point perspective, so now I'm going to speak for myself as a SME, a developer and architect. A closed source solution must prove it's 100% necessary and best in its class. And I'm going to look for ways to remove or mitigate it in the future, as it's just a cost against my budget. A closed source solution is dependent upon must have the highest availability, fantastic support, regular updates, and provide learnings, and I'm not paying that much extra for it. An open source solution that has become closed source has kind of burned bridges and created a will. I'm probably not going to take a call from those vendors that maybe I'd contributed in the past or colleagues of mine had contributed in the past and now they're closed source. An open source project, now this is an Isaac thing, but an open source project really needs to make me aware, and I'm going to go check it out. I love looking at open source projects. And I'm going to be eager to see if I can plug it in, use it, and contribute back. If I'm doing a lot of blogging or writing and I can, help out, I do that. And I am glad to look into purchasing support and extend it if I need to. Like that was how kind of a lot of our CentOS licenses became Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So in summary, try a lot of open source options when you need a new system or process. Pick the tool that your developers have buy-in in, because they're the ones who are going to support it. They want to. And you have the capabilities to support. No sense in buying, say, a Windows solution if all your engineers are Linux and vice versa. Scale support for high availability and disaster and self-service get that full SRE support. And you might stop right there. Your needs may be met, and we stop at number 3. But if you scale beyond that, and I can think of some systems that we have that are kind of open source, but we're not kind of really needing that scale, look at cloud options. Look at, if you have Redis and you're trying to scale it, look at Memory Store. Pivot to whichever clouds. And by being on an open source standard, if, say, I mentioned Memory Store or GCP option, if they all of a sudden price went nutty, I could look at Redis options in other clouds or use Valkey and Kubernetes. Thank you.